Hey writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. I'm Stephanie, your host, and the publisher operations specialist here at Kobo Writing Life.
I'm Joni, and I work on the business team of Kobo Writing Life. On this episode, we interviewed author Juan Pablo Villalobos, who has just released a title called The Other Side, Stories of Central American Teen Refugees Who Dream of Crossing the Border. It's a narrative nonfiction title which gives the different and true experiences of 11 unaccompanied migrant teenagers who crossed the U.S.-Mexican border.
So he talks to us a bit about the research process that went into this book, what it was like interviewing minors for the content that he was later putting in the book, and then also how his projects have changed over time and what he likes to write. So, yeah.
I hope you enjoy it. Before we get into today's interview, we have an exclusive offer from Joanna Penn in celebration of NaNoWriMo. If you're not sure what NaNoWriMo is, it is National Novel Writing Month. It is a global challenge to write 50,000 words over the month of November. We are giving it a try here at Kobo HQ. Steph, how is it going for you?
It's not going great. I'm struggling a bit, but I'm hoping in the next couple of days I'll finally figure out what I'm working on and how to make it better.
You absolutely will. And what should you download?
So if you're looking for more writing tips, we have an exclusive offer on Joanna's title, The Writer's Toolbox 2019, and her audiobook, The Successful Author Mindset. So you can use promo code KWLPODPEN, that's pen with two N's, PENN. And if you use this code at checkout, you'll get 50% off either the ebook or audiobook. So make sure to use the code because who doesn't love 50% off? And here is a brief sample of The Successful Author Mindset.
One of the most common questions that I get asked is how to balance writing and marketing. First of all, we are creatives first, and you will eventually be driven back to the page by that internal sense that you need to write. I get grumpy if I've not been writing enough, and often feel relief when I can just have time alone to write. But if I've let it get that far, I know I've been distracted too much by other things that might seem important, but are likely things that won't last and won't impact my body of work. Then you need to consider maker time, when you create, versus manager time, when you do everything else associated with being an author. This concept was first articulated by Paul Graham, programmer and founder of tech startup incubator Y Combinator, where companies like Airbnb and Dropbox originated. Say no to distraction when you're in maker mode. Distractions during maker time might include blogging, Twitter and Facebook. They are not inherently bad, they just distract us from our true purpose as we head down a rabbit hole on the internet, losing hours in the process, or when we focus on watching what others are doing instead of creating our own art. As Steven Pressfield says in Turning Pro, resistance hates concentration and depth. Resistance wants to keep us shallow and unfocused, so it makes the shallow and superficial intoxicating. But why is this so hard to do? Have you checked your email in the last half hour? Are you addicted to your smartphone or tablet? Do you crave that social media hit? I'll admit to struggling with this as much as anyone, and there's only one way to deal with it. Turn off email, Twitter, Facebook and anything else distracting during your maker time. Turn off all notifications on your devices. Use a computer with no internet access if necessary and put your phone on airplane mode. Put headphones on and play whatever helps to dull ambient noise so you can concentrate. Because there is no such thing as multitasking. There is only task switching, which means that your depth of concentration is broken, and the muse won't tolerate these distractions. There are no rules, but you need to find your own way to focus and go deeper into your own creative concentration. For more on this, check out Deep Work by Cal Newport. Every day, we have to make the decision to be a professional writer with professional habits. There will be days when we will lose. No one said this was easy. But over time, as we develop the habit, we will find ourselves winning more days than not. On the field of the self stand a knight and a dragon. You are the knight. Resistance is the dragon. The battle must be fought anew every day. Steven Pressfield, The War of Art.
Thank you again for joining us. We're excited to hear about your new book. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and about your writing career?
I have 4 novels already published. I've written them originally in Spanish, Three of them were already published in English, and the fourth is coming out in April next year. I also have this book of chronicles on minor immigrants. It's like a testimony book called The Other Side, which is the last one. And I also have a book for children, a novel for children. So these are my 6 books. And I have a new novel in Spanish coming out in February next year. So this would be my 7th book. Yeah. I'm Mexican. I live in Barcelona. I write in Spanish. I also write in Portuguese. I translate from Portuguese to Spanish, and that's it.
How did you start writing?
Well, actually, I started when I was a teenager, when I was maybe 14 years old. That was the time when I also started to read a lot. At home, my father had a small library on books of philosophy and literature, and I started reading Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and things like that. I don't know why, but it was like that. And he also had books on UFOs and paranormal activities, which I really love. And I started writing poems, and I never again wrote poetry. But then after some months, I became more interested in short stories, which was the first thing that I wrote, short stories. And then I studied Hispanic literature. I was thinking in becoming a writer, but I thought that I needed an education, a formal education in literature. And actually, I still believe that there's no place for naivety at our times, that a writer needs to have a deep knowledge of the literary tradition and of the literary theory. And that's why I went to the university. I wasn't thinking in becoming a professor of literature or an academic, but I thought that was the way of becoming a writer, and also doing some workshops. And I was for many years writing short stories and trying to write some novels, and I was failing again and again trying to write a novel. And then back in 2003, after I finished my degree in literature, I got this scholarship from the European Union to make a PhD in comparative literature in Barcelona. And that's why I came to Barcelona originally, to make this PhD. And in 2006, I finally, after more than 20 years of a very long process of learning, I finally managed to finish my first novel, which is Down the Rabbit Hole. It's a very short novel. It had around 60 pages in the Word document where I was working. And I finally published that novel in 2010. And something really weird and fantastic happened. That the novel had some success, and then many translations started to come out. Until our days, it has been translated into 15 languages.
Wow.
which is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it was something I wasn't thinking about when I published the novel. And then, as my first novel had this recognition, I mean, after that, it became not easier, but it became clear that I had become a writer and that I should keep writing.
Awesome.
Did it get easier with every book that you wrote?
No, the process. No, actually, the process is the same. I think I always say that maybe writing is one of the few professions or activities where it seems like you never totally learn how to do it. I mean, the feeling that I have when I start to write a new book is that I don't know how to do it. And it's the same every time. And actually, I rewrite a lot. Of each of my books, I maybe wrote about 7 or 8 or sometimes 9 versions of the novel. And it doesn't get better. I mean, it's not like the first time it was 7 and the second was 5 and the third was 3 and I'm improving. No, it's because I really believe that each book is different, and each book has a different way to be written. And to find out how to write that novel or how to write that book of short stories or of testimonies, for me, the process of finding out how is the interesting part of writing. I mean, I don't believe in replying just a formula or replying just a way that you found when you were writing one book. I mean, for me, it's not interesting to keep just replying a model.
So you write YA and you've written short stories and some adult novels. Did you plan always to write broadly across different genres, or is that just something that happened?
Well, actually, I feel more comfortable writing novels. I write some short stories always or almost always commissioned. I mean, commissions from magazines or newspapers or websites. And I really like to write under commission. I mean, when you have some restrictions, they say to you, you have to write about this, and you have to write with a limit of words or with a limit of space, and sometimes with some direction about what they would like to receive. And I like to write under commission. So short stories, it's a place where I can maybe rehearse. Yeah, try to prove new things. And novels for me are the place for freedom. I mean, for this thing of trying to find a way to write the novel that I was talking about. And then the last book, The Other Side, which is a totally different book comparing to what I have done before. It was, at the beginning, it started as a commission because 5 years ago in 2014, an editor from an American magazine contacted me and asked if I was interested in going to Los Angeles to interview a couple of teenagers, minor immigrant, and to tell their stories in first person. And why? This is interesting because he thought that I would do a good job on that because he had read my first two novels. The first one, Down the Rabbit Hole, is told from the point of view of a child. And the second one in English was called Quesadillas. It's told by a teenager. So he thought that I had the tone, the narrative tone, the point of view, the ear to tell the stories of these kids in first person. So obviously, I thought that it was important to do that. At that time, we had a major crisis, a huge crisis in the border where around 70 or 80,000 kids and teenagers were detained in the border between Mexico and the United States. So I went and I interviewed these teenagers and I wrote their stories in first person. And the stories were published both in Spanish and in English. And after that, my publisher now at FSG, Grace Candle, read the stories and contacted me and said, hey, what about if we make the same, but with more stories and we make a book? And obviously, I thought it was a great idea, and I thought that it was a necessary book, even an urgent book. But then it was a very long process. That was in 2015. Between 2015 and 16, I was writing a novel, and I couldn't involve in another project. Then in 2016, finally, I went to the United States to interview these 10 kids and teenagers. And after that, I came back to Barcelona with all the interviews recorded. And then I managed how to use this material, how to transform these testimonies in a book. Because obviously, for me, it wasn't interesting just to respect literally the testimonies. I mean, for me, it was clear that I was trying to make a literary book. And that's why I decided to ask to my publisher to give me some freedom to work with the material. And she accepted, and she gave to me the freedom to transform the testimonies in some kind of short stories. And that's why I like to say the content of the book is nonfiction, because everything that is said in the book is true. but the form of the book is fiction. There's a very simple example. One of the stories is a diary. And obviously for me, but I don't know if it's obvious, obviously the kid, he didn't write a diary. So I organized all the information of his testimony as a diary. So the dates are approximate, but that's not important. I mean, what is important is that to try to create and to transmit to the reader some empathy. And I believe that that would be more difficult to reach if I respect the testimony. I mean, because the testimony is very hard to read, and it's important from a point of view, from a journalistic or anthropology point of view, but that wasn't the book I was interested in writing. So for me, the most important thing was to create this book with some literary, let's say, power of emotions. And for me, the mission of this book is that for some hours while the reader reads this book, that maybe he or she can feel and understand what's happening with these kids and why they are running away from their countries.
I think that's a really important project because I think it's a really good way of, like you're saying, creating empathy in people. Like, I think that was one of the big things with Oliver Twist, right? Apparently that did more for social change than any other policies back then, because people were reading a story they could relate to and they could understand it from a human perspective rather than what we see on the news, which is horrible, but people maybe don't relate in the same way.
Well, yeah, if it's a personalized story, I think your interest.
Yeah.
What was it like interviewing the people that you featured in the book?
Well, it was difficult mainly because, well, first of all, they are kids. So
how old?
They,
what age range?
Between 10 and 18, maybe one or two of them were 18 or 19, but made the journey when they were minor. Mm-hmm. So most of them, actually, they still don't know how to deal with their stories. I mean, and I should say how to tell their stories. It's not just because they are kids, and learning to tell our own stories is something that happened when we grow up. We learn how to tell what happened in our lives, but also because the experience of the journey is traumatic. I mean, it's dramatic and traumatic. I mean, they passed through a very dangerous and risky situations. And obviously, that is something that maybe you don't want to remember. And when I was interviewing them, at the beginning, the first interviews, I remember that I was acting like a journalist, like trying to get details of their stories, and trying to make fact-checking of the stories, like, well, listen, how is that you say that when you cross the border between Guatemala and Mexico, how is that you are saying that you arrive to Monterrey if Monterrey is in the north of Mexico? It's not like that. I mean, and I remember that I showed to one of them a map of Mexico, like saying, look, Monterrey is here. So if you cross the border between Guatemala and Mexico, it's impossible that you arrive to Monterrey. But obviously, after a couple of interviews, I noticed that first, details were not that important in my book, because my book wasn't a book of investigation. I mean, a journalistic book about the truth about immigration. And second, and I believe that more important, that these confusions and these conflicts with the memory and these problems to remember the stories and to tell the stories, that was a very important part of the book. I mean, that I should respect that maybe to let that in the book, that confusion, that inaccurate details on the stories were important also to make the reader understand that one of the most important things that we have to make in life is exactly how to tell the story of our lives. And in the case of these kids, it is so important because one day we'll go to the court and then we have to explain their stories to a judge. And if they don't know how to create empathy with the judge and how to prove to that judge that they can't go back to their countries because they are in danger. So if they failed telling their stories, they won't get legal residence. Mm-hmm. So that's dramatic. That's when you perceive that sometimes learn to tell your story. It's a very case of life and death.
I also studied Hispanic literature at university, and something that I'm thinking as you're speaking is I think a lot of Latin American literature tells real stories in a fictionalized version, tells real stories about history and conflict. Is that something that contributed to the way that you chose to tell this story?
Yeah, actually, I don't know why, but the truth is that all my books are political. That is not something that I planned, that I previously decided, this book would be about inequity or about poverty or about violence. That's something that just happened. I don't know why. And actually, my new novel that I wrote after The Other Side, it's again a political novel, and it's about the rise of the far-right movements that it's happening now around the world. But it's something that actually I'm not sure that I can explain so easily. I mean, why? I don't know. And it's true what you say. I believe that for us Latin American writers, it's in the construction and maybe of the idea of what is a writer. There is an important part that is political. A writer is someone who tries to change or contribute to change reality, to contribute to create social and political changes. And maybe that's naive, but that's part of the idea of what is to be a writer in Latin America.
Yeah, when I think about some of the Latin American books that have been widely read in English, they're all quite political. And they all tell a story in a fictionalized, accessible way, I guess, which is it's a really effective way of transmitting a message, I think, internationally about stories that maybe people wouldn't hear.
Yeah, actually, maybe 20 years ago, in the 90s and beginning of the century, we had for some years a more diverse literature where the political issues were not that important. But then with the beginning of the century and with the failure of some of our hopes and the recognition that we were, as for example, as Mexicans, that the NAFTA was failing and that we had again a lot of problems and violence in our streets and drug trafficking. So again, the political issues became very important for us, for the writers. And it's true that this is different, for example, here in Spain, where I live. So maybe in Spain, the political issues became important maybe 5 years ago or 7 years ago because of the huge economic crisis, after all the global crisis, after Lehman Brothers and all that stuff. And many political novels appeared also in Spain, but maybe in Spain the last 20 or 30 years were of meta-literature, autobiography, autofiction, and not that worry about political issues.
Did you find, you said that you went to school because you wanted to learn more about how to be a writer. How much did that influence or affect your writing? Are there any authors that particularly inspired you?
It was very important, yeah. And I'm very aware of the strategies and of the techniques of fiction. And my last novel, which will be published in English in next year, it's called I Won't Expect Anyone to Believe Me. It's very conscious of the proceedings of autobiography and autofiction. And actually, it's a parody of that kind of literature. It was inspired by theory. I mean, the autobiographical pact says that the writer of an autobiography or the writer of a diary, the first that says to the reader is, you have to believe me. I'm telling the truth. This happened. And he's asking you to believe. And so my novel is called I Won't Expect Anyone to Believe Me. So it's in the title. I mean, it's the opposite. And in the novel, there is a theory about humor and literature. Humor is one of my most dear issues and in all my novels. Not in The Other Side, which is a different kind of book. And obviously it's not a humoristic book. But my novels, in some way, all of them are humoristic. And I have been thinking and writing a lot about the strategies of humor in literature and the limits of humor and political correction, etc. So that kind of issues are in my latest novel.
When it comes to working on translation, particularly things like humor, was it all handled by your publishers or were you working with translators at all? And how do you manage translating humor? Is it one of the most difficult things?
Well, it's tricky. And actually, that's why I always like to work with my translators. And after 4 books, I happily can say that I become friend of my translators. Rosalind Harvey made the translation of my first 3 books into English, and the new one was translated by Daniel Hahn because Rosalind was very busy and she couldn't. But to work closely with them is very important because, not just because of humor, it is because there's something very profoundly, deeply Mexican in my books that needs to be sometimes not explained, but maybe needs to make it understandable to the international reader. And with one of the books, with I Will Sell You a Dog, which is my 3rd novel, happened something very extreme. On that book, on that novel, there is a reading club. And that reading club, during the novel, is reading a Mexican novel called Palinuro de Mexico. And Palinuro de Mexico, it's a novel by a very prestigious and very well-known Mexican author called Fernando del Paso. But it's not that famous. It's not that, popular, well-known. It's just well-known between writers and well-known between academics and critics. And that inside Mexico, outside Mexico, he is not totally unknown, but he's not that well-known. And I thought that international readers would think that reference to Palinuro in the novel, that it would be like some kind of symbol, and that they couldn't understand the novel because the novel was too Mexican and the novel was cryptic or hermetic because it has some references to Mexican culture that they don't understand. And the truth is that the only reason why this reading club was reading Palinuro was because it's a huge book. It's a heavy book with 1,000 pages. And it is important because at some point, the book as an object will be used in the novel, as a weapon, actually. And I thought, well, let's change the title of the book. I mean, in the translations. Let's use a different kind of book. Let's use an international title that any reader can understand that it's just a huge book. So me and Rosalind started to think what book we could choose to make the change. And at the end, we decided to put Proust, La Recherche. But we find out that actually it was a better decision even than Palinuro, because that novel is about the loss of the hopes and the past of time, and all the characters in the books are old men and old ladies remembering their lives, and that was the lost times. So we decided to change the book, and some publishers like it. that much the changing that even in France, the title of the novel is different. I mean, it's not I Will Sell You a Dog. And in French, the book became The Lost Times. So I'm open to that kind of changes because I really believe that a translation, it's a different book. I mean, a translation, it's actually a version of the novel. And for me, translators are writers. I mean, the work of the translator is very similar to the work of a writer. I mean, they need to take some decisions. Obviously, they have this frame. The frame is the original the original version, but they are creating. And translating, it's not about to find the proper words and the proper concepts. It is about taking a book and putting into a different culture, into a different context. And the readers of that context, the readers of that culture, they need to understand that book from that point of view, the point of view of that culture. So I'm always interested in working with my translators because of that reason.
Yeah, translation is fascinating. What about, you said it's very Mexican. Do you have to make any adjustments for your other Spanish-speaking readers, or not really?
No, actually, we are very used to read, I mean, Mexicans, we are very used to read Argentinian writers and Peruvian writers or Uruguayan, etc. And we understand each other. I mean, some words are different. Obviously, some expressions are different, but we are used to them. And actually, my last novel, I Won't Expect Anyone to Believe Me, it's about a Mexican who comes to live in Barcelona. And many of the characters are Argentinians, Spaniards, Mexicans, Italians, people from China, Pakistan, etc. It's a multicultural novel. And it's written in different registers of Spanish. So you have some characters writing and speaking Argentinian, Peruvian, Colombian, and this is impossible to translate, obviously. So that's a true. But in Spanish, if you read the book in Spanish, you will notice that this book is written in different registers of Spanish.
You've mentioned that you write a lot of political books, but I'm just wondering how long it takes you to write a book with like research and writing it out, because I feel like it might be different for every genre, or do you have like a...
Yeah, I usually writing a book took me between 2 or 3 years, something like that. The other side was different because it needed logistic organization for the interviews and work through NGOs and lawyers to get access to the kids. So this book took me maybe almost 3-4 years.
And in that time, the border crisis has gotten a lot worse, hasn't it? From when you started doing this. So it's more relevant now than ever, I suppose.
Yeah. About research, actually, for me, just try to create some kind of atmosphere in my mind, some kind of atmosphere around me, not with facts, not with historical and details about characters or spaces, etc. But it's more like something like a feeling. I mean, so that's why when I start to think in a new novel, I identify the issues or the kind of literature that it can be a good influence to that writing. And I start to read a lot about that. For example, for my new book, I read during the last maybe 2 or 3 years a lot of books on UFOs, extraterrestrials, and paranormal activities and mythology. And the important was not to take notes and to develop the plot with that fact. The important was to get access to some kind of feeling, to some kind of atmosphere, which is important for the process of creation.
So it's like method acting. You're immersing yourself in something.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recommendations for people who are interested in reading Latin American writers or Hispanic authors? Any books that you particularly enjoy or authors you especially enjoy?
Well, I would like to recommend 2 Mexican writers, very young Mexican writers. that are now recently have been translated into English. One of them is Veronica Gerber. Veronica published a beautiful novel, short novel called Empty Space. It was published by Coffee House Press. And the second is Fernanda Melchor. Fernanda will publish in a few weeks, I believe, maybe in October, November, a novel called Hurricane Season. It will be published by New Directions in the United States. And so both are short novels. Fernanda's novel, Hurricane Season, is a very political novel again, very violent, very interesting. And Empty Space, it's in some way a political novel, yeah, too, but it's more subtle. It's a beautiful book, a really beautiful book. And there are some of my heroes also. I would like to recommend Cesar Aira, an Argentinian, which has been translated into English widely, and an Uruguayan writer, Mario Lebrero.
Those sound good.
Great. We'll put together a list of those along with your books.
If anyone was interested in finding you online, where can they find you?
On Twitter.
Okay.
It's like my name, Villalobos, my last name, Villalobos, JPE. That's my Twitter.
Wonderful. We will share that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for speaking to us. This was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're looking for Juan Pablo's book, make sure to check out the Kobo store because it is listed there. Or if you're interested in learning how to grow your sales, visit kobowritinglife.com. This episode was produced by Stephanie McGrath and Joni DePlacido. This episode was edited by Kelly Robotham. Music was provided by Tearjerker, and thank you to Juan Pablo for being a guest on our episode.
If you're ready to start your self-publishing journey today, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.